Good morning. My name is Janie Montblanc, and on behalf of the Great Basin Fire Science Exchange team and our partners, I would like to welcome you to this webinar titled Vegetation Restoration in Response to Pinyon and Juniper Control Treatments, presented by Bruce Roundy, plant ecologist at Brigham Young University. Before I introduce our speaker, I want to let you know that you may ask questions of the speaker or me at any time during the webinar by typing your questions into the questions pane of your control panel, which is located at the top right of your screen. I will keep questions for the presenter in the queue and field them after the presentation. I also want to let you know that whatever you do in your control panel does not affect the webinar presentation, so you're welcome to type a test message or test your audio at any time during the webinar. If you're having problems with your audio, please open your audio pane and check your audio option selections. Now I would like to introduce our presenter. Dr. Bruce Roundy is a plant ecologist and professor of wildlife and wildland conservation at Brigham Young University in Provo, Utah. His research projects include establishment ecology of weeds and native plants, vegetation disturbance thresholds for management of sagebrush systems, watershed responses to management practices, and increasing diversity of fire rehabilitation and other range seedings. He has been an integral part of the Sagebrush Step Treatment Evaluation Project, which evaluates methods of sagebrush step restoration and fuel management in the Great Basin. Welcome, Bruce, and thanks for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Janie. And I want to thank you all for spending your lunchtime with me. I also want to thank those who are showing up there on the title slide as graduate students or colleagues in the Sagestep project. I'll be reporting on research that's been conducted over starting around 2005, mainly funded by the Joint Fire Sciences program. Okay. Can you see my screen okay?
Not yet.
Okay, so I need to click clean screen.
Yeah. Yes.
Show my screen. Okay. Screen one clean. Okay. Can you see my screen now? Are you good?
Yes,
there?
We're good.
Okay. Okay. Again, I want to thank all my cooperators for these studies. And these truly are cooperative efforts. Without the land management agencies helping us implement the treatments or letting us measure on their sites, we couldn't conduct these studies. But in the end, hopefully these studies go back and help many of you who are managing these lands. So we have a lot against these piñon-juniper trees. We chain them over here on the left, we burn them, we cut them down, we burn them, and we shred them. We do a lot of shredding in Utah. We like that. And you know, should we be doing that? I was at a conference last week with Janie, and there were some people questioning that. Here's a view from the Stansbury Mountains and about 100 years later, and you can see how the trees have come in and dominated the sagebrush steppe there. When I went out with Wayne Pageant of the Wasatch Cache Uinta National Forest to find some sage steppe sites to test our treatments on, he wanted to treat thousands of acres out here, but for this reason or that reason, they weren't going to get treated. So along came, but we did find a site, and we went out and implemented our treatments of burning, cutting and dropping or shredding, and compared that with the control. But along about August 2009, we had heavy winds and a fire started over in Skull Valley, and in 3 days we burned 44,000 acres with the Big Pole fire, and it burned right through all these acres that Wayne was never going to get to treat, and burned over our fuel control treatments, and we're learning something from that. So I know this is anecdotal, but the fact is, deciding not to treat means that you may abdicate treatment to wildfire. And let me just give you a few statistics here. 340,000 hectares of piñon-juniper burned in the Great Basin annually according to bulk in a Global Change Biology article. 30 million hectares of piñon-juniper in the western United States prior to settlement. That was considered to occupy less than 3 million hectares. Miller estimates that about 10% of the trees today were present before 1860. It takes about 60 to 90 years to reach closed canopy on a lot of these sites, and Miller and Tausch estimate that 33% of our stands are in closed canopy conditions in Nevada and California, but that will likely double in the next 50 years. So deciding not to treat may be deciding to let fire treat under high fuel conditions. And in that case, what you get is fire rehab treatment. That's what you're going to do. So I'm going to, and this is mainly about piñon-juniper treatment, but having studied rangeland revegetation for many years, I've just got to say my piece about fire rehab because I've studied that also. And one of the things that you get in burned piñon-juniper systems is a water repellent layer under the canopy. Some work by Daniel Zaburston and Matt Madsen showed that your water repellent area after a fire is highly correlated with your juniper canopy area before the fire. And so the fire drives these organic compounds down in the soil and you get a water repellent layer after fire. And we know that we try to get in with our emergency stabilization money and seed right after a fire, right after that fall after a fire. And one thing that could happen that we don't want to happen is these seedlings could germinate, not get through this water repellent layer, and be left high and dry. In the meantime, cheatgrass hangs out. Nitrates accumulate up here because they don't leach down. And when our fire rehab seedings have failed, then cheatgrass can come in and dominate in these halos. If you don't have a lot of residual perennial grass, then you tend to get a lot of cheatgrass. So I just want to emphasize from some work we've done that I feel hasn't been maybe emphasized enough lately is that you can do something about this in a piñon-juniper system when you do have fire rehab. Now normally we like to drill our seeds, we get much better success, but you can't do that when you got a bunch of burned trees there. So we found in Utah, and I heard just last week in Nevada, that we get much better success when we aerial seed these areas and then we pull a chain to bury the seed. Not only does that put grass seeds in a good site for establishment, which we've known for years and has been reiterated in this book, Restoring Western Ranges and Wildlands, but Matt Madsen has found that it also, chaining can break up some of that water repellent layer and increase seedling establishment. So I just say, you know, if you're going to let fire manage your system and you do fire rehab, when you do aerial seeding, bury the seed and break up the fire or the water repellent layer by pulling a chain over, and that works a lot better than just aerial broadcasting. But what we'd really like to do is treat these lands based on resilience theory and practice, which means in the case of piñon and juniper, treating before we get a closed canopy and then severe fire and have to do fire rehab. And so some of our research has been aimed at when do we treat, early invasion, mid-invasion, or what happens if we treat at these later invasion stages. We worry that if we wait too long, it could go to cheatgrass and pass this biotic threshold. Whereas if we treat earlier, we'll at least maintain some of our shrubs and perennial grasses, and that's a more resilient community and also more resistant to cheatgrass invasion. So we're basically asking the question, when should we treat as trees encroach? And in this regard, Miller and Tausch have come up with this phase 1, 2, and 3. Here's where the trees at phase 1 are coming into the community, but the understory still dominates. Here the trees in understory share dominance, and here the trees in phase 3 are dominating. Robin Tausch and I have kind of quantified this with what we call the tree dominant index, which we take the tree cover and divide it by the tree plus shrub plus tall grass cover. These are the main resource users in the community. And then we say phase 1 is 0 to 0.34, tree dominant index. Phase 2 is in between there, and phase 3 is greater than 0.67. For some other studies where we weren't able to calculate the pre-treatment tree dominant index, we've also come up with some ranges of tree covers for these phases that I'll be talking about. Okay, so low, medium, and high tree cover. In actuality, tree cover is a continuous variable, and it increases in patches or across an expansion front. This is actual subplot data from the Sagestep study, which were some 11 sites pre-treatment. And you can see as your tree dominance index increases, your tree cover, of course, goes up, your shrub cover goes down, your tall grass cover goes down. Short grass doesn't go down as much, but it still goes down a little, and forb cover even decreases. But especially shrubs are very sensitive to increasing tree cover. If you look at biomass, and this is from a subsequent shred study that we did in Utah, the herbaceous biomass greatly decreases as your tree cover increases, and your shrub biomass also. So doing nothing means the trees are crowding out the understory and setting it up for fairly intense fire conditions. And so, you know, as that happens, you lose your understory, your diversity, and you say, well, how could allowing infilling to occur hurt carbon sequestration? You expect to save more carbon in the trees if you have more trees and above ground and below ground tree biomass. But what can happen is you always have to remember fire can come along, be the manager, burn these phase 3 woodlands, and then if it goes to cheatgrass, you sequester a lot less carbon than if you had a shrub grass, perennial grass system. Ben Rao has shown that. We're all concerned about wildlife habitat with the sage-grouse and other sagebrush obligates, but we also find we lose watershed function, especially on erodible sites when the trees dense up and we lose our understory shrubs and grasses. So I'm going to report on extensive research. We treated some 11 sites in the Sagestep study. I'll report on 9 of them. One of them burned, the Stansbury site, and one of them still hasn't had 6-year measurement after treatment. So I'll report on 9 of them. Those study sites went from western juniper over in Oregon and California, piñon-juniper in Nevada, and Utah juniper and piñon in Utah. So across this wide range of study sites. We subsequently were funded by Joint Fire Sciences to study shredding in Utah, and we didn't implement those treatments, but we went out and found sites. We determined pre-treatment tree cover before the shredding was done using NAPE imagery, and that worked pretty well. So we were able to match up plots on untreated and treated areas having reasonably the same tree cover, so we could determine the effect in relation to pre-treatment tree cover, and we did that on some 40 plus sites across Utah, some in the Great Basin area and some in the Colorado Plateau area. So I'll be reporting on those things. And in the shred study, we got into some tree sites, and normally we don't treat tree climax sites which have shallower soils, more coarse fragments, less water holding capacity, and their tree age is greater than 150 years. Rome and others refer to these as persistent woodlands. Normally we treat these wooded shrublands where we figure these trees have expanded into sagebrush steppe. But we did find some 15 of our 40 plus sites were tree climax sites and had been treated, so we did some measurements on them also. I would say that on some of these tree climax sites, you're still seeing infilling of small trees coming in and tree canopy increasing. We also did some mechanistic studies. For example, Kurt Young studied effective shredding in phase 3 juniper woodlands and took detailed measurements of nutrients and other resources, as well as carbon and plant establishment. And he detailed that, and I'll talk about some of those responses. On the shred study, we took a lot of samples and studied digestible carbon and microbes and nutrients in relation to frequency of plant occurrence, different microsites on the shredded site, on the shredded treatment versus untreated treatment. So I'll talk about some of that. After all, the implementation of these treatments is done to control fuels. So I just want to give you a perspective on that. Prescribed fire was used on the Sagestep sites, so we were able to look at that. But we also did cut and drop across most of the region, and in Utah we also did shredding as well as cut and drop on our Sagestep studies. And here's again the Stansbury site, just to take a look at how these practices help control fuels. So we did these treatments in 2007 at the Stansbury site, prescribed fire, and that was one of our best prescribed fires. We got a really thorough burn because we did it at the end of September when it was dry. And then we did cut and drop and shredding. Well, when the Big Pole fire came in 2009, we were able to see what happened. Now, we didn't have a measurement of fire severity out there other than we had these soil moisture stations, these fiberglass enclosures that hold microloggers attached to soil moisture and temperature sensors. And so what we found is in the prescribed, what had been prescribed fire burned earlier and then subsequently burned in a wildfire, all those stations were clicking away happily, no loss of equipment. But in the two mechanical treatments, the cut and drop and the shred, we basically fried the soil moisture stations. The batteries were glued to the fiberglass, total loss of equipment. So that's our measure of fire, intensity and severity there. The fact is, hot wildfire burning through any treatment where you leave the fuels on the ground is going to create high fire intensity, and that could translate into severe response for the vegetation. But what I'd like to just mention here, and this comes from anecdotal evidence from Brad Jessup, who works for the BLM, when you do put these fuels on the ground, it allows easier suppression, and you can see that in this series of photos where a fire was burning through the canopy, hit a shredded area, and the flame lengths dropped way down to the ground, which allows the suppression crew to come in there and put out the fire. So the ability to put out fire may be enhanced greatly by these mechanical treatments, but the danger is if they do burn, they can be fairly intense. So just to show you what happens with fuels as you get infilling, this is with 30% pre-treatment cover. Here's your 1,000-hour fuels, untreated or cut and left on the ground. When you cut, you basically just put it on the ground, and after 3 years the needles fall off and you have less chance of fire, but you still have a lot of 1,000-hour fuels and 1-hour fuels on there. If you burn, you greatly reduce those fuels. That's what these red bars are. If you shred, you take the 1,101-hour fuels and you mainly make them into 1-hour and 10-hour fuels. So you change these fuel size classes. If you have 60% pre-treatment tree cover, you double all these fuels. So letting the trees go is going to increase your fuels and your chance of fairly severe fire. With the Sagestep study, because we got pre-treatment data and measured over the years on these masticated treatments, we found that you do have a disappearance of fuel, but it's mainly in the 1-hour fuel size class, and that could be photodegradation because these things aren't incorporated too well in the ground, but you do have a loss of fuels, and that's in Wyatt Shakespeare's thesis. One of the problems with putting these fuels on the ground mechanically is then when you do get subsequent wildfire, it can burn the growing points of the grasses. You've already lost the shrubs if you've done a prescribed fire, except for the root sprouting shrubs. So this was some Stansbury cover loss 1 year after the Big Pole fire, and we need to go about and see how it's done years later. But you get a greater loss by the 2 mechanical treatments, cut and shred, of your herbaceous species. Tallgrass, perennial grass, perennial herbaceous. Much less loss on the fire plots because you don't have as severe a burn. And also you get a greater loss of cheatgrass, but you know it wants to come back. So what some land managers are doing, and maybe some of you are doing this, is after mechanical treatment they'll go back in a cool season and do spot burning to reduce the fuels and subsequent incidents of fire. Now I'm going to shift gears a little bit and talk about responses on the Sagestep study. Now these are 9 sites from Oregon all the way over to Utah, where we measured at 3 years and then 6 years response to fire, cut and drop. And then I'll talk about shredding from the Utah shred study, how that relates to this. And so if you go out and measure on all these plots, and there's a lot of them, this is like 140 plus plots, subplots per treatment across these 9 sites, you get this tremendous diversity of cover response for the cut, the burn, and the untreated. And how do you sort this out? Well, you use analysis of covariance. Your factors are the treatment factors, but you can put it in a covariate tree dominant index, or you can put in tree cover as a covariate, and you can start sorting out at what tree dominance, pre-treatment tree dominance or tree cover, you're getting differences in response 3 and 6 years later. So that's what I'm going to report here. And what I'll have is the year 6 response, and most of this hasn't been reported in a publication. The 3-year response is reported in Rangeland and Ecology and Management, the September 2014 issue. But the 6-year response is I'm just reporting it now. So on the left I'm going to show you the 6-year response, and then on the right I'm going to tease out the burn and cut treatments 3 years after treatment, year since treatment, and 6 years since treatment, to just show you the successional trajectories we're getting. So with shrub cover, first of all I want you to notice as tree dominance increases, shrub cover decreases. So when you're getting to about 0.4 tree dominant index or 20% tree cover, you've already lost 50% of your maximum tree cover. So that's going on without doing anything. If you burn, you lose your shrubs, you get less than 5% tree cover, but after 6 years you've got an increase of maybe back to about 5% tree cover. But it's not like the shrubs come racing back. If you have more root sprouting shrubs like rabbitbrush, this might come back faster, but sagebrush is going to be slow to come back. So if you want to keep your shrubs, obviously you do a mechanical treatment because it doesn't reduce them. In fact, it increases them. So after 6 years you didn't get any reduction, and you got about a 5% increase in tree cover by doing the mechanical treatment. If you look at the burn from the 3rd year since treatment to 6, you get about a 3 to 4% increase. So the shrub cover is increasing, but it's pretty slow. On the other hand, you kept your shrub cover and even increased it if you did a mechanical treatment. Looking at perennial herbaceous cover, what happened after 3 years is the perennial herbaceous cover was about similar on the control and the burn, and it still is similar 6 years later. It looks like it's increasing relative to the control, but statistically it's not different, even though it has increased a few percentage points. The cut, on the other hand, had an increased perennial herbaceous cover, and you got the biggest increase at the highest pre-treatment tree dominance. So that surprised us. These perennial herbaceous, mainly tall grasses, were coming back quite well even at phase 3 pre-treatment tree covers. In the end, on the Sagestep study, you've got about the similar as untreated on the burn for perennial herbaceous cover, but you've got about 11% better than untreated on the cut treatment after 6 years. So you really do increase your perennial herbaceous by taking these trees out. So then what I did is I took the cutting treatment for the 9-site Sagestep study, and I found 16 sites where we had shredded, and they were juniper expansion sites, and they weren't seeded. And I compared those statistically for tallgrass cover and perennial herbaceous cover, and I found no significant difference between mechanically cutting in the Sagestep study and shredding in the Utah study. So averaged across both of those studies, you see that tallgrass cover is increased, about 10% by shredding or cutting, and perennial herbaceous cover is also increased. So in the end, if you wait too long to treat these trees, you're going to get a perennial herbaceous dominated community and lose your shrubs, but you are going to get a pretty good perennial herbaceous response. The other thing I want to point out here is you lose about half of your maximum cover when you wait till the trees are 40% cover to treat. It's better to treat before then if you want to keep more of your perennial herbaceous cover. But we did get a positive response even up to high tree cover percentages. And mechanically cutting was about the same as shredding. One of the things that can happen with mechanical treatments is you do miss some of the trees. Either you miss them or there are buds you miss that grow near the ground. And so trees start coming back, and they're doing that on the Sagestep study. In previous research on chaining, after about 8 years, they start to repress the understory. But you also have sagebrush coming back as seedlings. And we found this in the Sagestep study. That's what these data are for both the burn and the cut, where those seedlings are coming back. On the Utah shred study, we found sagebrush seedlings on about 60% of our sites. And on the shredded treatments, they were occurring about every 2.5 square meters. On the untreated, they were about every 14 square meters. So you're getting a lot more sagebrush recruitment in the shred. If you shred and seeded, you found sagebrush seedlings about every 1.5 square meters. So you are getting sagebrush recruitment by taking out these trees. That's increased. So I've told you the good news. The bad news, of course, is that when you take out the trees, cheatgrass wants to use the resources too. And we're showing on the Sagestep study that that's especially true on the burned area. You're getting up to 15+% more cheatgrass cover at high tree dominance, pre-treatment tree dominance on the burn versus the control. You get maybe about 10% maximum more on the cut. So cutting or shredding does also increases cheatgrass cover, but burning especially increases it, and it increases it most at the high pre-treatment tree dominance. So if you wait longer to treat, you're going to especially get more cheatgrass where you had less perennial herbaceous understory here at these high pre-treatment tree dominance or tree covers. And here's our Greenville bench site, and you can almost see a line here where we burned in the plot and got a lot more cheatgrass than over here where we didn't burn. And that's kind of what's occurring here. So looking at the 3rd year versus the 6th year, what's happening over that 3-year period? Well, cheatgrass cover is increasing more on the burn than on the cut. And so it's tending to increase on our burn sites in the Sagestep. And you say, well, how much cheatgrass cover makes it an at-risk phase? Nobody really knows for sure, but according to this diagram by Brooks, we know conceptually that if you have these non-native annuals increase the fine fuel load continuity, they also increase ignitability, fire frequency, extent, and a seasonal window, and that feeds back into itself. Whereas if you have these native perennial herbaceous plants dominate, you reduce that fire frequency. And so that's one reason we get large cheatgrass fires. In a paper by Link, he said that if you increase cheatgrass cover by 20%, your probability of ignition and fire goes up 60%. So that's kind of what's out there in the literature, but it depends on many different things. One thing we do know is tall grass and tall and perennial herbaceous plants definitely suppress cheatgrass. So I took some of these different study populations: Sagestep not seeded, Utah expansion sites not seeded, Utah expansion sites seeded, Utah tree sites not seeded, Utah tree sites seeded overall. And I divided them up into sites that had less than 10% cheatgrass cover and those that had more than 10% cheatgrass cover. And then I plotted the tall grass cover for that. And in every case but one, I found that when you had greater than about 14% tall grass cover, you had less than 10% cheatgrass cover, okay? Except on this Utah tree not shredded, and there was one site that had both high cheatgrass and tall grass cover, and that was a Colorado Plateau site that had very sandy soils. And we're finding that cheatgrass is benefited to some degree by sandier soils. So, you know, what's the message here? Try to maintain your tall grass cover. Try to treat before you lose it, and that would be treating generally before you got to 40% tree cover. We also plotted our treatments by site for the shred study and found that when you had perennial herbaceous cover greater than about 35, you also had less than 10% cheatgrass cover. So these perennial herbs are the key to resisting cheatgrass. In that regard, there were about half of our shred sites have been seeded by the Forest Service or BLM, and you know, they didn't do that randomly, but they said, we think there might be a chance for cheatgrass dominance here, we're going to seed. So these might be more cheatgrass susceptible sites, but for both our expanded sites, which were about 29 of total and 15 of the tree, when we shredded and seeded, we got less cheatgrass cover. So here's your shredded seeded, here's your shredded only, and you get increased cheatgrass by taking out the trees, but you do suppress it a bit by seeding. Not as much as we'd like to suppress it, because not all our seedings look this good. And it also helped to suppress cheatgrass on our tree sites quite well. So when you're worried about cheatgrass, better to seed. And seed before you shred, so the vehicle out there going back and forth across the site helps plant the seed. So why do we get these responses? You know, it's basically a matter of propagule pressure, what's there, and the nutrients that are freed up. And so I'll talk a little bit about that. And you can see on these shredded sites, the plants around the edge where the litter is not too thick really do get a bonus of resources. So if you look at disturbance, it directly impacts the pretreatment community. For example, a fire will take out the shrubs and generally leave the perennial grasses. A mechanical treatment will leave the shrubs and perennial grasses and take out the trees. Fire takes out the trees also. But this disturbance also can affect the microclimate and the resource pool, which is also affected by site characteristics like elevation, aspect, slope, growing season, precipitation, seasonal precipitation. And so these effects go into this post-treatment microclimate and resource pool that then affect the residuals that are left after the disturbance. And so that's kind of our working model to kind of sort this out to see what effect we're getting. And it can vary by site. Site characteristics can determine the outcome here by affecting this post-treatment microclimate and resource pool. And one concept that I really like is what Ryle and Leffler at Utah State came up with, and they said really these plants exploit different parts of the environment, but the upper 30 centimeters is where they make most of their growth. Now in the cold desert, really you get a lot of your growth in April and May, and it dries out in June, or it's too cold in March, maybe not this year, but most years. And so what happens within those few months there, when the temperatures are warm enough for growth and water is available, makes a big difference. And so not just the available water, but if your water is highly available, then nitrogen can diffuse to the roots. But if water's on the dry end, there's no nitrogen diffusion to the roots. So you kind of have this resource availability, residual or propagule pressure that determines the outcome of your community. We've measured soil moisture on these treated sites for 8 years now after treatment. And this is additional spring days where the soil's wet if you treat in phase 1. And so you're adding on up to another month of available moisture, usually less than that, but at least 10 days of available moisture. And even 8 years after treatment, you're getting maybe half a month or more of available moisture by taking out these trees. And so the succession is still proceeding, and who's going to use all those extra resources is still down the road. Will it be cheatgrass? Will it be the shrubs? What will it be? So there is a bonus of resource availability in a very resource-limited window seasonally for these communities. So that's why you get a big response, especially when you do it at phase 3. Here's another thing that we've discovered on kind of our 6th year after treatment. And what I did is I plotted the cheatgrass-tallgrass ratio for our 9 different sites. And on all of those sites, we got an increase of cheatgrass relative to tallgrass 6 years out on the burn, much more so than the untreated or the cut and drop. Only one site, Oniki, didn't show that response. The other 8 did, and especially these other 2 Utah sites, Scipio and Greenville Bench. So we're measuring soil moisture and temperature, so there ought to be something that correlates with that. And this doesn't explain all the variability, but we found that on the burn sites we have increased wet period in the fall and increased soil temperature in the fall, which would help fall germinated cheatgrass as a winter annual to do better. We also have greater winter frost-free days on the burn versus the untreated, and greater spring wet degree days. In other words, we're accumulating time above 0 degrees when the soil's wet more on the burn than the untreated. So these in part explain why we get better cheatgrass on the burn. You also tend to get more nitrogen, and it may be sequestered in that water repellent layer and which breaks down over time, and then the cheatgrass can take advantage of it. So the message here is try to get a treat when you have more tall grasses if you're going to burn, because cheatgrass likes to be burned. We're trying to understand network-wide. While some sites tend to get more cheatgrass than others, and Gene Chambers and Rick Miller have developed this excellent field guide where they talk about how more mesic or warmer soil temperature regimes tend to support cheatgrass better. You definitely see that in the Wyoming sagebrush. You see much more resistance up in the mountain sagebrush. In between, it's a little less clear how that works. We're doing some work separating this out on our shred study, and Nathan Klein has found that you can actually use random forest to plot areas that are going to be more highly susceptible to cheatgrass based on these geospatially derived variables that we have. And so he'll be publishing some of that. We hope to come up with better guides. We also found that sites with more cheatgrass tend to have greater temperature variation, increased solar radiation, and increased sandy soils compared to the less dominant cheatgrass sites. So we're trying to sort that out better, but we haven't figured it all out yet. But this soil temperature regime guide is a good one to go by, and this is an excellent publication to guide you in your selection. One thing to always remember is if you decide not to treat, fire could treat, and then you may not be happy with what fire does. Shredding has also been found, not talking about burning now, but shredding to increase the time of available water substantially. And we found out, Kurt Young found this out, was mainly due to taking out the tree. Although the litter you put on there decreases soil evaporation a little bit, it's mainly taking out the tree. He also found inorganic N is increased on mounds and interspaces throughout the year when you masticate trees. And this could be due to a greater available water and diffusion of the nitrogen to these resin capsules he uses. He planted cheatgrass and blue bunch wheatgrass out there on masticated and untreated, and he found they produced much more biomass on the masticated side at different microsites. Both cheatgrass and blue bunch were benefited. So yeah, you're giving it resources, and it's an excellent seeding environment, but it's also a good environment for cheatgrass establishment. In our shred study, Zachary Anderud measured mineralization potential for N and total available P, as well as a number of organic carbon fractions, and he found these sorted out by microsite. In general, what you got was greater N, mineralizable N on the shred in the inner space mainly, rather than under the tree, and that's why you get better growth of these plants after you take out the trees in the inner space. And you got more available P. So here's two nutrients that are mainly limiting besides water, and water also increasing after you shred, so no wonder we're getting some good responses. He also showed that perennial grasses and cheatgrass both like these extra nutrients that they're getting from taking out the tree, and he showed higher frequency of these species there. So in conclusion here, as I wrap this up, I've come up with a simple chart here. If you really want to maintain your shrubs, you should use a mechanical treatment, and you should do it before you get to 20% tree cover, where you will lose more than 50% of your shrub cover. But you might want to do some follow-up cool season burns to reduce the fuel and potential of subsequent fire. If you really want to reduce your fuels, you can use prescribed fire, but you really ought to do that where you have good perennial grass understory, and do it in phase 1 so you minimize your cheatgrass response. If you want to minimize cheatgrass, you should mechanically treat at less than 40% tree cover, where you get more of your perennial herbaceous cover hasn't been lost yet. And if you're really worried about cheatgrass potential, you should seed before you do the mechanical treatment. At least with shredding, you get some pretty good response. With mechanical, the follow-up may be necessary. So that's all I have to say until you ask me some questions. Thank you for your attention.
Great, thanks so much, Bruce. All right, so if you have questions for Bruce, please type them into your questions pane. That is found in the top right, in your control panel on the top right of your screen. Okay, the first question is from Scott Spakeen, and it's a multi-part question. So he asks, treating phase 3 sites means certainly chancing that land managers will be treating large fires. To do earlier treatment, is it ever going to be possible in large scale to treat the juniper and piñon early enough to maintain the shrub grass communities? And should I ask the whole question, or do you want to answer that one first?
Sure, and you may have to remind me.
Okay, so the second part is, and can any mindset that allows at least 30 good productive non-natives like Siberian wheatgrass and Bassia help with the overall problem? Can the BLM ever fund pre-burn restoration in large scale?
I think they are. I'll kind of answer those backwards.
Okay.
A lot, with the 2000 fire plan, and I don't know if Scott works for the BLM or what your fuels budget is, but we see with the 2000 fire plan vegetation management taking off as we reduce fuels, and that's done best when ecologists get involved, because they can also improve other resource values. So at least we're seeing a lot of treatment going on, millions of dollars in treatment actually going on, and now in sage-grouse areas, which isn't necessarily Utah, but over in the bi-state area, they're using sage-grouse initiative support and fuel money to treat before we have these big fires, and treating at phase 1 or 2. So yeah, I see that actually happening. I wasn't sure about question number 1, but number 2 was something like, can we treat early enough? Maybe you might have to repeat that one. Let me in the meantime say, as far as seeding non-natives, in Utah they seed a mix of natives and non-natives, forbs, grasses, and shrubs. So there's always some introduced species in there, but there's also usually some blue bunch wheatgrass and some other natives in there. But you'll have to remind me on the other 2 questions if I missed it.
I think there were just 3, so you answered 2 of them, and the first one was, is it ever going to be possible in large scale to treat the piñon and juniper early enough to maintain the shrub grass community?
Yeah, I think they're doing that in Utah, but they also got some watershed restoration money, and with sage-grouse initiative money, you can. But frankly, my own opinion, I haven't run all the stats, but I think fire is going to treat more than we do, just because we let it get way ahead of us during you know, the last 30, 40 years where we didn't do hardly any vegetation treatments. So we're still going to do a lot of fire rehab, and that's not bad. We've had some good success out of that in Utah, but we have a lot of introduced grasses holding back cheatgrass and maybe not as much shrubs as we'd like. So yeah, I think it's possible. You may get more of a bonus if you're in a sage-grouse area. You may get a better chance to do treatments there, and you may see funds shifted away from non-sage-grouse areas. I'd be interested in anybody else's opinion on that question.
Yeah, if you have opinions about that, audience, please type them in to your questions pane, and I can share those with the group. Sorry we don't have the technology to open the mics up. Hopefully someday soon. Okay, we have a question from actually someone who's in my office here with me. Charlie Duncan has a question about pollinators.
Mike, with you being in Utah, you know James Kane, I'm sure.
Right, and he's worked on pollinators for years. Yeah.
Yes, and lately he just came out with a paper last year about nest depths on minor bees, and the fire pretty well, the conclusion was that fire doesn't do much damage. The ones underground seem to survive okay, unless there's increased fuels over the soil, which shredding would raise that soil temperature too high to maintain the pollinators.
So do the bees, they're ground nesters, and they nest under the juniper? Excuse me.
Well, usually they nest in open areas where there's no vegetation. So but if you're shredding and it just gets spread, or do you like put it in windrows, or do you keep even layer?
So what happens in your shredding, if you look down at this picture that I've got on the screen, I don't know if it's still up, but typically in shredding, the shredded material makes a bit of a halo around where the juniper canopy was. Now for watershed purposes, you'd like to see it more in the inner spaces because it will increase infiltration and decrease erosion in the few studies we've done. But it doesn't, usually if it's like a $500 shred project where they're made to go back and forth and distribute it, $500 per acre, that's kind of unusual. They're usually more like $150 an acre, and they just shred and leave it right there where the canopy was.
I see.
So I think that would minimize the effect on the bees, but I can't say for sure.
Right.
I do know that forbs are a minor component of a lot of these communities. That can depend on the site, but they're pretty important where they do occur.
Yes. Yeah, because the seeding after treatment with the forbs would help the following year to maintain the pollinators.
It would, but we have not had a lot of success seeding forbs. We get maybe some yarrow, some flax, and then we tend to get most success from our introduced ones like Saint Foin or small brunette. And so we haven't made that jump yet to where we know how to very successfully establish forbs.
Yeah. Has there been any trials with annual forbs?
There may have been. I'm not too aware of any, but that people have suggested that.
Okay. All right.
That's a good question.
Okay. Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Well, that looks like our last question.
Really?
Yeah. I guess your presentation was so good that you answered all the questions.
Well, I hope there were some, some positives for the land managers that are doing these treatments, because you'd hate to see all this money go out for fuel control and not have some benefits. But I think in general we can say the benefits are good, and treat earlier if you can.
Great. All right. Thanks so much, Bruce.
Thank you.
Wait, don't leave yet. We would greatly appreciate it if the audience would take our 3-question survey of this webinar that will appear after the webinar has ended. And I wanted to let you know that a recording of this webinar will be sent to you automatically through the GoToWebinar system tomorrow, and we'll also post it on the Great Basin Fire Science Exchange website within the next couple of weeks. Our 7th webinar in this series, titled Assisted Succession, Context and Tools, presented by Jerry Benson, will take place on Tuesday, March 17th. If you have more questions regarding this webinar or have future requests for webinars, please email or call me at any time. Thank you all for your participation today, and thank you so much, Bruce, for your presentation.
Thank you.
All right, have a great day.
Thank you.